Welcome to Heading for Extinction and What to Do About It. And before I get started, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on the land of the Wurundjeri people and pay my sincere respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Also to acknowledge that they've been in rebellion since colonisation. And I'd also like to acknowledge that we're in a time of climate and ecological emergency, and that what we do is of great importance. So I hope that by the end of this talk, you'll be joining the rebellion or getting more active or staying active. Back in 2007, I was not paying attention to climate. I thought we had 100 years. I was bringing up two kids, the two boys on the left. I was a psychologist until someone persuaded me to go to a climate talk, and I saw this graph. It was the year that the Arctic ice suddenly went into decline, and the ice was melting way, way faster than scientists had expected. The thing that scared me even more was hearing after that the scientists were afraid, and they were already, back in 2007, talking about buying land in Tasmania or in New Zealand. So 6 years ago, I quit my job, and now my day job is Extinction Rebellion. Today, we're going to talk about telling the truth, acting as though the truth is real, and rebelling. And it's going to be a bit of a roller coaster ride. The first half of the talk is down, 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 into the depths of the climate and ecological emergency. The second half is what to do about it. So it can be quite an emotional journey, and the important thing is to make room for any feelings you've got. Could be grief, could be anger, could be fear, but it might also be determination, and some people even experience relief, just hearing that there are people who are taking action. So I'm going to start with the first part of the talk, which is tell the truth. I'm going to whiz through the science and not go into it in much detail. If you're interested in the science, it's in this booklet, which Googles up pretty easily. I'm going to dwell on the science a lot because I think you probably all know the Earth is already too hot. Sometimes people talk about 1 degree, 2 degrees. You know, we're not quite at 1.5 yet. We've got to stay under 2. But why do we need to worry about 1.5 or 2 degrees of warming? We know for sure the Earth is already too hot right now. And that's why we're seeing converging crises. So in Australia, we've had massive droughts, followed by floods, followed by unprecedented fires, in which over 1 billion animals died. And now, of course, a pandemic. One way of looking at this is it's the new normal. Another way of looking at it is it's the start of something much worse. And of course, it's already a lot worse in other parts of the world. Right now, in Bangladesh, 3 million people are experiencing flooding. So they've got the pandemic and flooding at the same time. That's 1/3 of their land covered with water. In Africa, we've got a plague of locusts causing famine at the same time as the pandemic. And even without the locusts, there were already 820 million people in famine around the world. So things are very serious, but the problem is that they're about to become more serious still, and this is because of tipping points. There's a lot of tipping points, a lot of feedback loops. And the thing about them is that you can end up with a cascade of tipping points. And with any tipping point, before you actually reach the tipping point, there's a point of no return. It's like when you're heading towards the waterfall, but you haven't got there yet. There's a point at which you can still paddle to the shore, and there's a point at which it's actually too late. The current's got you, you're going over that tipping point, which is the edge of the waterfall in that case. So we don't know exactly where the point of no return is for a cascade of tipping points for planet Earth. We've already got some momentum in the system, some momentum towards warming at 1.1 degrees of warming. If If we reach 2 degrees, there'll be more. If we reach 3 or 4, we're pretty sure that we're over the waterfall at that point. We're just not quite sure where the point of no return is. But what Will Steffen, Hans Schellenhuber, and a number of other very eminent scientists said in a paper in 2018 was that they can't exclude the possibility that we could pass the point of no return even before 2 degrees of warming. This is a diagram from their paper. We've had a stable climate from the whole of human organised civilization. We've destabilised the system, and we're now basically heading for the waterfall. We're heading for the planetary threshold and a descent into hothouse Earth, and a largely uninhabitable planet. We don't know quite where that is, though. We hope we're somewhere still upstream, and that if we paddle hard, get to zero emissions at emergency speed, we can restabilise the climate. We don't know for sure. That's the climate emergency, but of course we're facing an ecological emergency as well. And it's not just the bleaching of reefs, tragic and catastrophic though that is. It's the death of a lot of animals, birds, insects, plants, what's been called the 6th mass extinction. And some of it's to do with climate, some of it's to do with the way that we're treating forests, the way that we do our agriculture. Back 10,000 years ago, 99% of the mammals were wild, by weight this diagram is, and there was about 1% humans. Now, of course, there's about 60% of mammals by weight are livestock, about 36% are humans, and just 4% left of wildlife. Included in that 6th mass extinction is an insect apocalypse, bees and other insects, a worm apocalypse. We're actually killing the worms with our agricultural procedures. And linked to the death of worms and to the death of the life under the soil is a soil emergency. A UN expert has said that we only have 60 harvests left. Now that's just an opinion and it's only approximate, but it's something to take seriously. David Attenborough, who used to be a very mild-mannered naturalist, now says that we cannot be radical enough in dealing with the issues that are facing us. And one of the things that Extinction Rebellion says, which has been somewhat controversial, is there is a possibility that humans could become extinct. Around the world, of course, there are already food and water shortages. In India alone, 21 cities are predicted to run out of water this year. It's not all climate, it's partly to do with how the water's being used, overused and polluted, but climate is playing a part. And as you get food and water shortages around the world, you can see already as well that food and water shortages are leading to conflicts and mass migration. The climate emergency is described as a threat multiplier for conflict. We've got millions of people who are already displaced. So there's 15 million displaced already in Africa, many within the borders of their own countries, but many also across borders. And we're looking at 1 billion displaced worldwide, possibly by 2050. The way the World Bank says it in very mild-mannered language is that there is no certainty that adaptation to a 4 degrees warmer world is possible. That's where we're headed by later this century on current trajectories. So that's a very mild-mannered way of saying that there's no certainty that humans can adapt in a 4 degrees warmer world. The climatologists have been talking about this for quite a while. This is Lonnie Thompson, paleoclimatologist, and he said back in 2010, climatologists, we tend to be fairly stolid. We're not given to theatrical rantings. But why then are we speaking out? The answer is that virtually all of us are now convinced that global warming poses a clear and present danger to civilization. So that was back in 2010. And this is also from 2010. Professor Hans Schellenhuber, founding director of the Potsdam Institute, advisor to Angela Merkel from Germany, advisor to the European Union, advisor to the Pope, one of the most eminent scientists in the world. And this is his opinion. If we reach 4 degrees warmer, he estimates that the Earth will only have a carrying capacity of about 1 billion people. About 1 billion. That means 6 or 7 billion dead. And we can only imagine what that process looks like. So having heard that the scientists were heading to Tasmania and New Zealand, of course, I could not resist the individual solution, the temptation of the individual solution, and I bought some land in Tasmania. But what use is that going to be if the social order breaks down? It's going to need more than just owning a title to land. It's going to need more than a barbed wire fence. If social order is breaking down, then the fact that I own land in Tasmania, it's not going to make any difference. So that's the good news and the bad news. There are no individual solutions. It's time for us to act as though the truth is real. We've tried a lot of different tactics. We've tried giant protests. We've tried election campaigns, Stop Adani, and focused, targeted campaigns. We've certainly tried petitions, but the fact is that it's just not working. What we've seen is that for the whole of the time that humans have been in organised society, there's been a limited range of temperature variation, but since the start of the Industrial Revolution, the temperature has been soaring, and all these IPCC discussions have made no difference. We still have emissions skyrocketing. There's no flattening of the curve. Why is this? It's because our political system is broken. We have a large number of people in Australia who actually think that it is a climate emergency, but we have a guy who parades lots of coal in Parliament as our Prime Minister. How did that happen? One of the reasons is that vested interests have way too much influence. One of the reasons is that we've got an economy that's addicted to endless growth. We're endlessly encouraged to buy more stuff, but all it leads to is unhappiness and plastic pollution. Well, it's an unfortunate bird. So what eminent leaders, scientists, including Christiana Figueres, are saying now is that it's time to participate in non-violent political movements wherever possible. Civil disobedience is not only a moral choice, it is also the most powerful way of shaping world politics. It's time to rebel. Eminent people acknowledge we've tried everything else. It's time for mass civil disobedience, because this is something that has worked in past movements. It's worked in the civil rights movement in the United States. It's worked for the suffragettes. It's worked when movements had tried everything else like we have. What Martin Luther King Jr. says is that when the law is unjust, we actually have a moral responsibility to disobey. And that's where we are now. Our governments are taking us towards destruction, and we have a moral duty to rebel. This is some research on this. Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stephan looked at 323 movements, and they found that non-violent movements were more effective, partly because people are more able and willing to participate. They're more likely to get broad support. They're more likely to get defections from the police and the military. They were looking at things like where you're actually trying to take down a dictator, where if the police and the military are against you, you've got very little help, very little hope. And after non-violent movements, the society is more likely to be free or democratic, relatively, afterwards, whereas you're more likely to end up with a dictatorship after a violent rebellion. They found that none of these movements they looked at failed if more than 3.5% were mobilised at a peak event, and many succeeded with way less even than 1%. Now, Roger Hallam, one of the co-founders of Extinction Rebellion, has done a PhD on this subject, and this is really just his opinion, but I like it. His opinion is that 500 people in jail, 5,000 arrests, they're about equivalent to 1 million people on the streets. And I was one of the people who helped organise the People's Climate March back in, I think, 2015. And the amount of work that went into getting those very large crowds was absolutely enormous. And yet the effect was almost zero. Smaller disruptive events with large numbers of arrests are easier to organise than large marches, and it does seem that large marches are losing their effectiveness. Now, we've got lots of examples of successful civil disobedience against specific targets in Australia. The Franklin Dam is a well-known one from way back. The Kimberley Gas Hub, and the Bentley blockade, the Lock the Gate campaign, that had great success in New South Wales and Victoria particularly. Extinction Rebellion started with just 15 people in the United Kingdom in 2018. It came out of a movement called Rising Up that had already been experimenting with some relatively confronting tactics, like spray painting in quite old buildings, mainly chalk spray though, like these flares. That's Gal Bradbrook spray painting the Murdoch press. In 2018, they decided to move into climate, and they formed the Extinction Rebellion as an offshoot of Rising Up, and they began doing outreach talks all around the UK. They did 60 over the course of that year. And one of the things that made it effective was that they were building to a set mobilisation date. So they were going around the country saying, are you willing to risk arrest? If you are, come to London on these dates in October and November. During October, local groups were formed, that had been formed, were practising roadblocks, not because blocking a road in a local town makes a lot of difference, but because you need practice to have your confidence and to know that you're okay working with people in your affinity group. They also did something which was controversial in some ways. They put a lot of pressure on the large groups to join them. The large groups would not promote their coming rebellion, so they actually staged a sit-in, but a very peaceful one. This is at Greenpeace. In October, they announced to the UK government they would declare a rebellion. They would rebel unless the government declared a climate emergency. Greta came down for the launch. They waited and undertook other actions like a blockade of the BBC, because one of their tactics is to put a lot of pressure on journalists and media outlets to tell the truth. But when it came to the 17th of November, which was the deadline, of course, the UK government had not declared an emergency. So they began the rebellion with a blockade by 6,000 people of 5 bridges in London with 180 arrests. They continued to build a movement during 2019 with, again, some quite confronting actions like blood of our children and a semi-nude protest during the Brexit debate. By April, it was an international rebellion in many, many countries around the world. And in London, they occupied 5 locations with tens of thousands of people. There were well over 1,000 arrests, and they managed to hold most of those locations for most of 11 days. And they got the magnificent result. After 11 days of disruption, the UK government declared an environment and climate emergency, and Theresa May also set a 0 by 2050 emissions reduction commitment. Not nearly enough, but still, it was a Conservative government that would have done nothing, I think, without these 11 days of disruption. The Extinction Rebellion has 3 demands. The first of these is tell the truth, that the government and media must tell the truth, and the part of this is declaring a climate and ecological emergency. The importance of declaring an emergency, even if you don't win everything else all in that first step, is that we have to move society into emergency mode. We have to have that emergency framework, that emergency state of mind, as we do when there is a fire or a flood or a pandemic. We've seen society move into emergency mode, especially here in, say, Australia and New Zealand, within days. Emergency mode can mean chaos. It can mean a fight for toilet paper or a fight for food and water, but it can also mean working together for the greater good. These people are part of 30,000 people cleaning up the streets of Brisbane after the floods in Brisbane. It can mean assisting those who need help, and it can mean acting with courage and compassion. Emergency mode. But declaring an emergency, that's only the start. We need the emergency action, and that means greenhouse gases net zero by 2025 and halting biodiversity loss. Can we really do it by 2025? Well, we don't know, but like I said at the start, the Earth is already too hot. We can't afford to keep making it hotter. We have to get to zero emissions as fast as we possibly can, and we won't actually know how fast that is until we're in emergency mode. It's going to mean a society-wide mobilisation at a speed and scale never before seen in peacetime. We have to change pretty much everything, pretty much immediately and simultaneously. But of course, we can't trust the government and the vested interests who are controlling things at the moment. That's why our third demand is for the government to create and be led by a citizens' assembly on climate and ecological justice. We want ordinary people deciding how to do the emergency transition, informed by experts, but making sure that the way that the transition happens is fair and just. Citizens' assemblies are like jury duty. They're a form of participatory democracy, where randomly selected people, advised by experts and supported in making wise deliberation, make usually way better decisions than the governments that we have at the moment. In fact, about some of the things that we need to do, the vast majority of people, in their heart of hearts, they already agree. We're the 99%. Most people, really a large percentage, agree our political system is broken. A very large percentage agree you can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. And pretty much everybody wants to leave a habitable planet for their kids. So we're at a point where the vast majority of people are united, or potentially united, around a life and death threat. And the encouraging thing is that at social tipping points, there's social tipping points that are like climate tipping points. And at those points, you see big changes fast. So we've seen the school strike grow from one school kid, Greta, to 7 million in just over a year. We've seen Extinction Rebellion grow from 15 to hundreds of thousands of rebels in 68 countries, again in just over a year. It's quite extraordinary, the growth. So that's just some of the groups around the world. Extinction rebellions in South Africa, India, France, Hong Kong, all through Europe, Asia, Africa, all over the world. Some of those groups are small, but they're growing. And they're continuing. Extinction Rebellion has been more difficult while the pandemic is on, but it continues. One thing we can do through just about any level of lockdown is postering, for example. There's a lot of paint the streets action been going on. And stenciling, you can do that pretty much, even while you exercise. House sign, definitely. It's very important to say that we're a non-violent movement, and there's no exceptions to this. We're non-violent in actions and in words. So one of the principles that everyone who is part of the rebellion has to agree to is that there's no blaming and shaming. It's a balancing act because we acknowledge that we've got a toxic system, a broken political and economic system, but the typical Extinction Rebellion way of dealing with this is that if you're outside, say, a fossil fuel conference or outside Parliament, you're not going, you bastards, you climate criminals, you're going, join us. You're aiming for defections from police and military, but also from the fossil fuel industry and from parliamentarians. Defections in the sense of crossing over to support emergency action. We are non-violent because we want broad participation from all sectors of society, because that's what wins support from the general population. It's also easier to get support from the general population for what is seen as ethical behaviour and for what is seen as a willingness to self-sacrifice. So we behave with respect to all people, we behave with respect, including police. But we nonetheless acknowledge that, of course, police can behave badly and that, of course, police are part of a toxic system. And certainly First Nations rebels and others from marginalised groups who've been treated badly by police may not feel respect towards police. It's not a matter of what we feel, it's a choice, a behavioural choice to behave with respect. We also recognise, of course, that there's an additional risk to First Nations people and other marginalised groups if they're arrested. Not everyone has to get arrested, and I think personally it's people like me, people with more privilege and who will tend to be treated better by the police, who particularly should be putting ourselves forward. One of the things that is powerful if we remain completely non-violent, even in the face of violence by police or by others, is that our resolute non-violence in the face of aggression tends to produce a backfire effect. This is Extinction Rebellion on a bridge in Paris, getting pepper sprayed in the face. Now, people have obviously had a choice to move back. Some have moved back and some have chosen to stay and remain occupying the bridge, but they're getting pepper sprayed in the face. Because this was obviously an excessive use of force, a tweet by Greta Thunberg about this went viral all around the world. So 4,700,000 views. This is just one example of the backfire effect. What we're aiming to do is to produce escalating disruption, focusing on the major cities. We're out of time to knock off, one project after another, save one forest after another. Our aim is to go to the centre of cities and shut them down for as long as possible, like they did in London. And the first stage of this is regular monthly local actions with a smaller number of rebels. This is practicing, getting ready, and also building the movement within your local area. The next stage is converging on state capitals for large-scale disruption of thousands of people. This is a bit like what we did in Melbourne, Sydney, and some of the other cities back in October last year. And then prolonged disruption for a week or more, if possible, in one major city or several major cities where tens of thousands of people are on the streets, like they did in London. That's the scale that we need to get the changes that we want. Extinction Rebellion has been going in Australia since November 2018. And it's now in all states and territories, or larger in some and smaller in some. And this is just some pictures from the rebellion in October in Melbourne. This is earlier from a die-in in Burke Street, in the centre of Melbourne. This is a bridge blockade. And these are the lovely red rebels. One of the features of Extinction Rebellion is a strong emphasis on art and creativity. It makes our blockades very beautiful. This is some of the people who were arrested in Melbourne in October. And this was one of our disruptive events, civil disobedience. We danced our way around the city to the tune Staying Alive, and it was dreamed up by some rebels in Melbourne. It's since gone viral. All around the world, people are doing civil disobedience. People say, oh, you're blocking the streets, doesn't it make people annoyed? And look, I think certainly people who are just stuck right there, not able to get through, can be annoyed. But this is a survey that was in The Age at the end of a very negative article during our Spring Rebellion. And it was a poll of 135,000 people. 84% in support, not just of action on the climate emergency, but literally in support of the protests. And again, even with a relatively small amount of arrests and a relatively low number of people occupying the streets, mainly in Sydney and Melbourne, but also in Brisbane and to some extent in other states as well, there were things that happened immediately after that I really don't think would have happened without our actions. One of those was that we had the largest petition, electronic petition to Parliament ever. 400,000 signed a petition asking Parliament to declare a climate emergency in a matter of weeks straight after the Spring Rebellion. And this didn't really hit the papers, but there were actually 3 climate emergency declaration motions that went to Parliament, 2 to the lower house and 1 to the upper house, all narrowly defeated. Again, all in the weeks straight after our Spring Rebellion. But this is the really important part of the talk. It is that bad. Things are that serious. We have run out of time. We are at a point where nothing much that I can think of is likely to work, except for mass civil disobedience. And look, when first I started to think, well, would I be willing to get arrested? I thought, oh, well, I'm a psychologist, I might get deregistered. But I think we're at a point in history where you have to ask yourself, if not me, who? If not now, when? We need as many of you as possibly can who are watching this today to join the rebellion, and as many as possible to at least consider risking arrest. We're in a very privileged position in Australia. We're much more able to protest without really massive repercussions than in some other parts of the world. And we are now the biggest exporter of fossil fuels in the world. So we have a number of reasons why there is an obligation, a moral obligation on us to do as much as we possibly can. If you really feel you can't, then look, there are good reasons why people might decide, well, no, I don't want to get arrested. Don't worry, because we need 10 to 20 people in other roles for everyone who's risking arrest. So, what do you think? Are you willing to take part in peaceful, disruptive civil disobedience? Are you willing to risk arrest? Are you willing to help in other ways? So that's the sign up. If you go to ozrebellion.earth, you can get on to our database and get whatever mail outs we have that are going. If you'd like someone to actually just help you get involved, could you email that email, xrmelbintegration@protonmail.com, and someone will give you a ring. Email them and tell them your phone number. Someone will give you a ring and just help you actually work your way through to getting involved. If you're already involved but you want to get even more involved, the place to go is the base. That's where we do our organising. You can go to our Facebooks, and it looks like there's a bit happening, but it's a bit of a mystery how it all is happening, how it's getting organised. If you go to the base, that's a good place to start. But it's also a thing called Modernised. That's where we do our organising. And look, I think it's really worthwhile signing up for the international news as well. There's amazing stuff happening all around the world. And if you go to rebellion.earth and